Okay. I'm clicking go.
Passionate, outspoken, insightful. Areva Martin is an award-winning civil rights attorney, best-selling author, legal commentator, and America's advocate. Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
Good morning and welcome to our viewers in the U.S. and around the world. To kick off this morning's broadcast, do me a favor. Please share the show with your online friends or start a viewing party. And remember to post a comment or question. Your voice matters, and I want to hear from you. You've heard the names Barbecue Becky, Permit Patty, Golf Cart Gail, and Corner Store Caroline. And Karen, so many Karens. And as you know, a Karen is generally defined as someone who throws a tantrum at your local coffee shop, who asks to speak to the manager over the slightest inconvenience, and who uses tears to get what she wants. It's also someone who calls the police on Black people for ordinary, everyday things, like sleeping in a library, swimming in a hotel pool, or using a key to enter their own apartment. We've watched countless viral videos of these Karens engage in what appears to be clearly racist conduct, but the term has people divided. Some say it's another example of the cancel culture gone too far. Others say it's a placeholder for speaking about the casual racism and privilege exhibited by some white women. My first guests are all victims of a Karen. Joining me today is Norinda and Fareed. They were building a patio in their backyard when their neighbor Susan called the Montclair, New Jersey Police Department, claiming that Fareed had pushed her. Let's take a look at some of the video footage from that encounter.
Could I please get at 44 Norman Road? I need
Wow. This is what she's been waiting 2 years to do this. She's been waiting 2 years to do this.
Pushed me off his property.
She's been waiting 2 years to do this to us. She's been waiting 2 years for this.
Are you crazy?
This is Susan that lives on Marion Road in Montclair.
In this climate right now, you're especially not supporting members of our community here who pushed me 10 feet. Sounds like you didn't do that.
No, I watched
because
it.
they're saying he didn't.
I didn't put my hands on you, woman.
Are you kidding me? Just because I came over here alone, I should have brought my son.
Now, are you threatening? Are you threatening
She's
us with your
not,
sons?
she's not admitting to it.
Are you threatening us
You're
with your
saying you
sons?
did it. Are you going to say you didn't put your hands on
Ain't
me?
nobody put their hands on
No
you.
one put your hands on. He
No one
put his hands on me. I asked you to please leave.
Oh my God, because you're attorneys, you know what to do.
Exactly. So please walk away from our property. Go away. Go.
Okay, just let her. So our kids don't have to see the police, please. Please just go inside with them.
He just got
Wow, welcome to the show, Norinda and Fareed. I have to ask you, watching that video, what sparked this outburst? What caused this woman Susan to just go into this rant and this rage? Caused what appeared to be just this big ruckus over what? What was this all about? We're not hearing your audio.
I would say, I'm sorry, that it really starts with her being told no. That if we could summarize it, it was about being told no. She'd initially come to talk to me about not the patio per se, but the roots of a tree that was on my property and whether I was protecting the roots. And I engaged with her, but I was in the middle of a work telephone call, and I told her I would need to, talk to her about this after my call. So that was the first no. And then the no, she came back before the end of the call. We talked to her more, but it was just saying no. If I could just summarize, really what the issue was, that she wasn't comfortable with hearing. And, from our perspective, wasn't comfortable from hearing from us.
And so to frame this is your neighbor, right? And this has been your neighbor for a couple of years before this incident occurred.
She's not our next door neighbor. Our fence is a butt. So she is, her fence and her backyard fence and our backyard fence are on the same line.
So if you're on the call, Narendra, you're in your house, I presume, on the telephone, as you said, on a work call. She wants to have this discussion about this tree, and you're telling her, no, now is not the right time. How did that conversation, that seems like a typical conversation neighbors would have, how did that go to her accusing you, Fareed, of having somehow pushed her or touched her?
Well, when I came downstairs, she had now moved to discussing the patio and questioning whether we had a permit. Though she saw two construction trucks in front of our house with the name of the company on the side with 6 workers with a tractor, she was inquiring. Those signs of legitimacy were not enough for her. So she wanted to know if we had a permit. She asked that question multiple times. When I finally asked her, was a permit required? And her response was she didn't know. So when I told her, well, why are you asking us for a permit if you don't even know when it's required? So then she switched to say, well, what about my property line? And everything that, again, anytime in which she was challenged with her rationale, because I challenged her additional about her property line and talked to her about something called adverse possession, but she just kept getting more and more upset. The conversation wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't going to relinquish her space in our yard. So I asked her to leave. And upon asking her to leave, her response was no. So for me, that was just mind-blowing. That
hold on, Fareed, I want to just get this clear. So she's on your private property, and you're asking her to exit your private property, which is your right. You have the absolute right to ask someone to leave the property. And she said, no, I'm not going to leave?
That's exactly what she said.
Yes.
So upon us demanding that she leave, that's when she came up with the story of, oh, you've pushed me. And it was a complete fabrication. But what it was her attempt that she could not force upon us answers or force us to submit. She decided that she would seek assistance to submit. And that assistance was the Montclair Police Department. She was reaching back to hundreds and hundreds of years of calling police, calling the state, calling the enforcers upon Black people and going to force us to submit. And if we were unwilling to submit, the truth of the matter is we could die that day. We could be forced up against police who could overreact, who could become violent, and who could make us submit by guns and batons and pepper spray and other things. And I believe she understood that. It's a long history from Emmett Till to what happens every single day. And her understanding of her power that extends beyond her person is what she was flexing upon us that day.
Now, at some point, she had to realize that this was being videotaped, right?
And she asked me to stop videoing it.
Mm-hmm. But she knew that you were continuing to videotape it. Did that cause her, the knowledge that this was going to be a video, did that cause her, to step back, to retreat, to try to, de-escalate the situation?
No, I mean, she was unfazed. She's unfazed by really anything. And so even though she wanted me to stop, she didn't stop her behavior. And what I thought was that if by videoing her, she might reflect on her behavior and try to calm down. That's the reason why I started to videotape her, thinking that it might make her calm down, but it didn't.
I also think that, this concept of Karen and the social media that explodes these issues is something that particular people see and are experiencing. But I think that oftentimes the people who are in the videos, it's not going across their social media feeds the same way. So I'm not even sure she really understood what the chain effect of her actions could be in this day and age. I think, you know, people who are on social media, people who are experiencing it know, like, this is how we react, this is how we protect ourselves. But I think she was clueless. And, you know, we did hear from her later that she was ashamed of how she appeared in the video. So, and
So you think she was oblivious to the fact that she was acting in this kind of stereotypical way that has now become associated with this, you know, the word or the name Karen?
Well, I don't think it's stereotypical at all. I think that is symptomatic of a feeling of entitlement and a questioning of our legitimacy. You know, I think that is much
Well,
like.
no, I meant that I was just asking you, do you think she was oblivious to the fact that she was acting in this way that we've seen played out in so many of these videos? Because you said she later came to apologize or at least to try to explain herself.
I do think that she was oblivious to the stereotype and this whole conversation that you're engaged in right now. I think she was unaware of it at that time.
So we saw in the videotape her running to like different neighbors trying to get, you know, validation that you had touched her. What were your neighbors saying, you know, in the midst of this video, this encounter?
So they were all telling her to go home. I think the first thing, and it may not be clear on the clip that you showed, was that they were asking her to go home as well. Everyone was saying, go home, just stop and go home. So that was the first thing. And I think, again, this is the no. And I want to go back to like this tantrum throwing is about being denied the effect of like you crying, whatever it is that you're crying, depending on the situation. So I think she expected by going to these neighbors who from the video you can tell were other white women, that she would get their support. And when she didn't get their support, their no, not just my no, but their no really also upset her deeply. And I think it was that really also raised, she was like getting, as she went to each one of them and trying to get them to lend their white femininity to her cause and being rejected, it really elevated her upsetment even more.
In addition, she rejected facts when coming to him. When they said, no, I saw the whole incident, he didn't touch you. Oh no, you just didn't see it. So neighbors really had to reassert themselves. No, I was looking out my window the whole time and I saw exactly what happened and he did not touch you. So, you know, we are very happy to live in a space that, you know, white people understand that they have a role in like counteracting such behavior. And those people within our community, specifically the young lady with the dog and then the neighbors who chimed in and followed, like took on the responsibility to continue our no and say, no, it's not going to happen, and no, we're not going to allow it, and stand for it.
Well, did the police actually come, and what was the reaction of the police?
They did come. And I would say that, again, all of these neighbors amplifying what we knew as truth really made the situation with the police much more neutral. So I think that they came, they spoke to her, they spoke to us, they spoke to all
but
of
let me say this though, they actually were not going to talk to the neighbors. They had come to me and they said, well, we're not going to arrest because there are no injuries, but we are going to make a police report. And I said, well, if you're going to make a police report, be sure to talk to these other neighbors. And the officer did, in fact, go talk to the other neighbors. And after talking to the neighbors, he goes back to Susan and then comes to me and said, well, I've spoken to Susan and she's decided that she doesn't want to pursue this if you're okay with it. Well, my understanding as a criminal defense attorney is because they have engaged in an investigation, understood that what she said was not true. And for her to pursue it would be committing a false statement, a further step in a false statement. It was a first false statement by just calling the police and alleging an assault. But to now swear in some kind of complaint that you've been assaulted after 4 or 5 witnesses said you have not, of course she doesn't want to pursue it. And I think the neighbors kind of made that happen, and the police did the right thing and not continuing to pursue it.
I want to bring into this conversation Adrienne. Adrienne was actually shopping at a CVS in Eagle Rock, California, when Heather Patton went on a racist rant and called her the N-word. I have to tell you that the video is profane, and I would advise, just viewer discretion in watching this video. But let's take a look.
Yeah, she's on drugs or something.
No, I just hate niggers. Fuck you, niggers. I hate niggers.
It's okay, we're calling the cops on you
I would
because you're disturbing everyone in
Wow. Okay, joining us is Adrienne. Welcome to the show, Adrienne.
Hi. Hi, thank you so much for having me. I apologize, I'm having some technical difficulties with the video here.
That's okay. I'm just kind of speechless. I've seen that video, and every time I see it, it leaves me speechless. Can you just set the scene for us? What happened inside this drugstore that, you know, resulted in this rant, this racist rant that we just witnessed?
Yes, this happened September last year. I had a toothache, so I went into CVS. This was in Eagle Rock, California. And so I went in to get my prescription filled that my dentist called in. So, you know, while you are waiting for the prescription to be actually filled by the pharmacist, you kind of have some downtime. So in my downtime, I started strolling the store and kind of just seeing if there was anything that I needed to pick up, just to kind of kill time. And so I heard a woman yelling, but I wasn't really tuned in to what she was saying because I didn't feel like anyone was talking to me, and I was just kind of zoned out because I had a toothache already. So the voice got louder, and then I finally turned around, and this woman is behind me. And I think my mouth probably fell to the floor because at that point, I realized that she was talking to me. So I turned to her and I said, "Who are you talking to?" Because I heard, as she got closer to me, I heard the N-word, right? So I turn around and she's like 3 steps away from me, shouting and yelling and accosting me, saying that, you know, we as Black people, she's like, "You Black people should be dead. We need to go back to the days of lynching and hanging you." And at that point, I feel like I blanked out for a minute. Like, I think I was so shocked because I'd never experienced anything like this. And I turned around and I started walking away from her to the counter. Everyone in the store was staring because she was really loud and belligerent. So I looked around and I knew that I was the only Black person there. So everyone's looking at me, everyone in line, the counter.
Well, we know Adrienne is having some technical problems with her connection. And I think we may have lost her.
She wants to get a reaction out of me. I'm not going to give her my power. I'm not going to do that. So as a result of that, nobody from CVS, employee-wise, called the police. So I continued to walk to the front and I asked the lady in front of the line, I said, "Please, can you call 911? And the lady's following me. Her name is Heather Lynn Patton. She follows me. Then I started going through my purse looking for my phone, and I pulled my phone out, and that's when I started recording her, and I was trying to record her. She walks towards the door. So the part of the video that you actually start seeing is towards the end of her rant and her assessment of me. She's, realizing I'm calling the police because nobody else in the store would help me. And she starts jumping up and down and yelling, and then you hear my voice saying she must be on drugs or something. Like, "We're calling the police on you." So when I said that to her several times, that's when she decided that she was going to leave the store. You see her jump up and down, shout more. She walks to her car, proudly says, "This is my license plate." And then she continues to say she wants all of us dead, calling us all niggers. And saying if it wasn't against the law, she'd kill me and kill us. And I'm just like, this can't be happening. I think a part of me was just so shocked. Like, I didn't know how to act because I'd never been in this situation before. I couldn't believe that this was happening. I think a part of me was in denial, a part of me was shocked, a part of me was angry. There were a lot of emotions. And I'm just glad that I did not act on those because it could have been very bad. For me.
And we're also glad, Adrienne, that it didn't end, with any kind of physical violence. Did the police ever show up, though? I heard you say that none of the employees in that drugstore came to your defense. No one did anything to help you. But I know you called the police. Did they actually show up?
They never showed up. So what I did afterward is after going home and calming myself down and talking to my family, I went and filed a police report, as well as the next day I went to go get a restraining order because, of course, social media being the wonderful machine that it is, I found out the lady's name and that she actually lived in my neighborhood and that she actually was in my industry. I'm a costume designer and she's a costumer in television and film. So all of this came out of social media. Thank God. And at the time I wasn't on social media. I sent the video to my sister because I was like, listen, I don't know if something's going to happen, but someone needs to know what happened there at that store in case something happens to me. And then it went viral and it went from there. And so people were really helpful with information because I had no idea who this woman was. So when I got to the police
So
department,
even though, Adrian, let me ask you, even though you're in the same industry and you found out you live in the same neighborhood, you had never worked with her before?
I had never worked with her before. And, as a costume designer, we have the privilege of being able to hire our own department team members. So naturally, I didn't know her. So I had never worked with her, nor obviously ever hired her. So I'd never bumped elbows or anything. I'd never met her a day in my life. And we're both in the IATSE union. So I did go to IATSE, and I thank God for IATSE. I also went to IATSE and reported her. They were the only ones that stood up for me. They were the only ones that actually pursued her. We had an actual court hearing within the IATSE union. They suspended her and fined her $15,000. And they stood behind me and said, we're not going to tolerate this type of behavior. So I'm very, very grateful to IATSE because they were the only ones to help me.
So I want to ask Adrienne and you and Norinda and Fareed as well can weigh in on this. When you all see these other viral videos, having been the victims of this racist conduct that we've been talking about this morning, are those other videos triggering for you?
Yes, ma'am.
It's triggering, yes. And I had used the video that we just looked at. I teach critical race theory at the law school, and I have used this video to demonstrate to my students modern racial violence. So it's really, and I think, when the other guest says that it would have turned out bad for her, I understand that pain, but no one's looking at the words that were said to her. Those are fighting words. Those are attacks. That's like, so it's so stressful. It's threats. And I think that this has to be viewed as the violence that it is, and her fear. I think that is so real, the fear, and it's meant to make you afraid, right? The woman these people are weaponizing both their words and the police state to instill fear. This is just really classic racial hate.
Yeah, I think you're right, Norinda, no doubt about it. These acts, these words are meant to intimidate. As you know, in this video we saw with Adrienne, this woman went as far as to talk about, African Americans being dead, using violence against African Americans. I want to bring in my third victim of one of these Karen videos. Her name is Janae, and she was actually sitting on a park bench in Manhattan, and Svetlana called the police on her 3 times, and on the 3rd time accused her of threatening her children. Good morning, Janae, and thanks for joining us.
Everyone, how are you?
So
Hi.
You had a situation, Janae. Let's take a look at your video.
Stroller. This is her stroller. Do you realize how far that is to come all the way over here to sit in my face? She said she playing the black card. That's what her husband, she said. I'm not even paying her no mind. That's how embarrassing she is. I was attacking you. Because it is my neighborhood. I got the right to sit here.
So now she's filming me. She's calling me a bitch. She came to me and my kids, threatening me. And now she's standing like I'm shaking. I'm pregnant. I have 2 kids with me. And she's filming me right now.
This is my building. It's my neighborhood. I'm sitting here by myself, trying to enjoy my time by myself. And this white woman is making me very uncomfortable.
us what we don't see on that video. What caused that woman to say that you were attacking her? I heard in a phone call, she says you're staring at her, but did something happen outside of that frame that we didn't see or that we don't know about?
No, I was actually just sitting there. It was a beautiful day. So I was just actually across from my building, just relaxing in the sun or whatever. And her 2 girls walked back past me originally. They just walked and, I didn't think any of them, she had the stroller. You could tell they're enjoying the weather as well. And she walked off and she sat down for a minute and she came back towards me and she asked me, she said, "Are you smoking weed?" And I looked at her because first I was confused because I wasn't smoking weed. I wasn't smoking a cigarette. I wasn't vaping. It wasn't smoke even around me for you to just approach me like that. So it was like, no, but like, mind your business. Like, you know what I mean? Like, enjoy your day. And then that kind of got her upset because it was like, who are you to tell me to mind my business? Like, you're not even supposed to be here. So my first instinct was to call my mom and then to start recording her because I see this happen too many times. So she started getting upset and she's like, "Oh, well, you shouldn't be here and just, why don't you just leave? Is a park, you shouldn't be smoking." And I'm telling her, "Miss, I'm not even smoking. Like, I don't know what's your issue, but I'm not smoking." She called the police the first time. "Oh, is it normal for someone to be smoking in the park?" One, we wasn't even in the actual park. I was actually like in the entranceway. It's like a bench right before you walk into the open space away from the park and the children and things of that nature. So then the call started getting like extra and because I'm like going back and forth with her, like, go play with your children. Like, you literally came out here with your kids. Go be a mom. Go enjoy your day. Multiple people coming, walking past us. They asking me, "Am I okay?" Keep in mind, this woman is pregnant. She has children with her. But if you are really in distress, and if that's what your storyline is like over 50 people out here. Someone would have come to you to say, "Hey, do you need help, assistance?" They didn't do that. They came to my aid. "You sure you're okay?" Because I'm getting upset at this point. But
we noticed that at some point she's on the phone talking to the police. Did the police actually show up?
Well, the thing is, 2 separate cops had came. So the first officers that came, they wasn't there for that particular situation. They were saying that they were canvassing the neighborhood for someone, but they were willing to listen to us. Because I stayed there. I didn't want to leave because I didn't have a lighter or anything. So I knew if the cops did come, they would, even if they were to search me, it would be like, well, she don't have anything. So it's like, what did you see? So when the cops did come, he asked her, but she started getting like irate with him. I also have a video of that where she was getting like belligerent with the officer. He literally walked away from her.
Yeah, I want to ask all of you, I'm going to put you back in the green room because I have a guest on who has a solution to this Karen problem that is growing. And we see these viral videos pretty much every day. You can't go on social media without seeing one of them. He's on the board of supervisors for San Francisco representing the 10th district. And he's introduced the Karen with a C Act to punish the behavior of these Karens with a K. And he's Supervisor Shaman Walton. Good morning, Supervisor Walton, and thank you for joining us. You've been in the waiting room. You've heard the stories of my 4 guests this morning. And I can imagine that it's those stories that have caused you to, put forth this new piece of legislation called the Karen Act. So can you tell us what this act does and why is it so important in this moment? We need you to turn your audio on, Supervisor.
Sorry about that. Thank you so much for having me this morning. The Karen Act, which is Caution Against Racially Exploitative Non-Emergency Calls to the Police, is a very important tool for us to punish people who are weaponizing 911 and using it knowing that when they call law enforcement in, it could bring harm to Black people and people of color. And the bottom line is this: we know that a negative interaction between law enforcement and Black people and people of color is literally about life and death. And so we have to stop that. If you look at Janae's case, if you look at the case here in San Francisco where we had someone call the police because someone was writing Black Lives Matter on their own property. If you look at Barbecue Becky and what happened in Oakland when someone was just barbecuing, Black people can't go about the normal course of their business. People of color can't go about the normal course of their business without folks threatening to call police on them, knowing that the consequences could be dire. So our act is basically stating if you willfully call a peace officer to come out because of a discriminatory reason, someone's race, someone's religious beliefs, someone's gender identity, sexual orientation, then you can be civilly liable for any consequences and damage to that person or that family, because this has to stop.
And I want to applaud you, Supervisor Walton, for taking, this bold step to try to find some solutions to help the victims, like the ones on my show this morning, and others who've been victimized by this conduct. But I have to ask you, we know that there's already, in the state of California, which is where you are, it's already a misdemeanor to make a false police report. So there's already laws that penalize that kind of conduct. And we know that you can file a civil lawsuit if someone, causes you some kind of emotional distress. So how does this Karen Act go further than the laws that already exist in the state of California?
So the current law basically states that you can't make a frivolous 911 call or a call to police and report something that is obviously false. But it does not say that you can't make these calls for these specific reasons, right? So it is a racially motivated crime if you call 911 because of somebody's race and their ethnicity. And that is the difference. And we need to make sure that it's spelled out and called out for what it is. We have folks who really literally are running around trying to use 911 to harm people of color. And we've seen people actually die because of that. And so this law is specific to those protected classes and specific to making sure that if you make these calls and they're frivolous and they're arbitrary, just because you feel a certain way about somebody different than you, then you are going to be liable. And that part is important. We have to stop this madness. We have to stop this discrimination, this racist practice of calling the police on Black people and people of color just because they exist.
And Supervisor Walton, there's actually a piece of legislation making its way through the State House in Sacramento that parallels this ordinance that you put forth at the County Board of Supervisors level. So that law, I think it's sponsored by Assemblymember Bonita, would make this a state law, or would make it a state offense for someone to use race or to weaponize race in the way that we've seen with respect to my victims. So what are the chances of your law at the county level and then this state piece of legislation that's being moved by Assemblymember Bonita? What's the chances of us seeing these laws actually, be signed by the governor, be on the books?
So Assemblymember Rob Bonta's AB 1550 actually has civil and criminal liability and penalties, which are fines. And that's happening at the state level. It's going through the legislature. Here in San Francisco, I have 9 total co-sponsors, including myself. So I can tell you that we will be passing this law here in San Francisco. We have to go on a 30-day hold, bring it to our Public Safety and Neighborhood Services Committee, get a couple of votes at the full board, and then send to the mayor's office for signature. But we have enough co-sponsors to ensure that this law passes here in San Francisco. I do believe it will be successful at the state level as well. And my hope is that this is something that spreads across the country, that people are protecting people of color from being violated just for being persons in their community and going on about the course of their day. I mean, if you look at Janae's case and the case I keep talking about here in San Francisco, where the gentleman was in front of his own home, minding his business. And I even heard the call to police. And the thing that gets me most is the entitlement with some of these calls. They kept asking him if he lived there and he didn't answer. And they felt that he was violating something by not answering them. What gives them the right to say he has to answer them on whether or not he lives there? Who are they to say that he has to tell them that that is his house? And these are the types of things that are happening when people are, instead of focusing on having a good day and going about their day, they're focused on criminalizing people of color. And actually, they're creating a problem that didn't exist.
And I just want to ask you one last question before I let you go, Supervisor Walton, and that's the police, because we know what's so scary about all these cases is that the police show up, like in the case of George Floyd, a call is made to investigate an alleged, counterfeit $20 bill. And then this man, George Floyd, is killed before our very eyes, that horrific murder. We saw in Rashad Brooks, again, he's asleep in his car. Someone calls the police and he ends up, shot in the back and killed by police. So it's the fear that the victims have, but it's the realization that when police show up and Black people are involved, Black people can end up dead, killed by the police. So what responsibility does the police have as we're having this national debate about defunding the police, changing the way police, respond to interactions with African Americans and people of color? What should the police be doing in these situations when they get these calls? Like you said, when somebody's trying to mandate, as we saw with Fareed and Norinda, try to mandate what they should do with their own private property. What role does the police have to push back on these callers, on these Karens, to tell them, mind your business? We don't have time to waste resources on getting involved in disputes where you shouldn't be involved in the first place.
Well, and that's why the onus is on so many different people in a case like this. So one, we're trying to protect people from protect people in community from people who make these frivolous calls, because that's one way we have to go. Obviously, Mayor and I and my colleagues are redirecting resources from the police department to invest in the Black community here in San Francisco. The district attorney and I introduced a resolution urging the Civil Service Commission to never hire anyone with excessive force from other cities and other municipalities. We're working on legislation to figure out what we can do for increased and better discipline of officers who are continuously getting excessive force and racial profiling complaints. So there are things that the police have to do, definitely. But we also have to make sure that these calls don't happen, because typically, whether you're the 911 dispatcher, or police dispatcher, or an officer, you go with the information that's given you. And when somebody's giving you information that is false or puts people in a position to where you're going to respond aggressively, that onus has to be also on that person that makes that call. And this is not new, right? We're just starting to see this on tape and on video. But even we can go back to 1955 when Emmett Till was killed and murdered because of a false accusation. These things have existed for decades, and they can no longer be tolerated because they lead to death for us. And I have several conversations with folks who've even made these calls, and they try to apologize, but they don't really realize the damage that they can do to a human being. And this has to stop.
Well, thank you so much, Supervisor Walton, for your leadership on this issue, and hopefully your law will get passed in in San Francisco, and we'll see something similar happen at the state level, and that this becomes a model for cities, states, counties across this country. Again, thank you for joining us, and thank you for your leadership. I want to encourage my Fareed and Norinda and Janae and Adrienne to just continue to stay and continue to listen to this conversation, because we have two experts who are coming up next, and they're going to help shed some light on, kind of what's behind these Karen memes, as well as the conduct of these Karens. So joining me now are two very well-respected professors. One is a professor of sociology and an expert on racism on the internet. She's the author of 5 books, including White Lies and Cyber Racism. Her newest book, Undoing White Womanhood, looks at the history of how white women contribute to systemic racism. She's Professor Jessie Daniels. Also joining me is Deidre McCloskey. She is a highly regarded economist, historian, and critic. She's the author of over 20 books, and she's one of 150 journalists, academics, and pundits who signed an open letter criticizing cancel culture that was published in Harper's Magazine on July 7th. Welcome, Professor McCloskey and Professor Daniels. Thank you so much for joining this conversation. I don't know how much you've been able to hear from my guests who have been on the first part of the show talking about being victimized by white women who've called the police, who use racist slurs against them. So I want to ask you, Professor Daniels, you've done so much work around this issue, particularly as it looks at racism on the internet. What is behind this conduct?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. I really think that what we're looking at is, as your Supervisor Walton was just saying, is really decades of entitlement and privilege, and specifically on the part of white women. It's certainly part of the systemic racism that we're used to seeing, but there's something about white women that the racial innocence and the sort of idea about femininity, sort of the idea that white women must be inherently good, gets combined in these actions by what we're now calling Karens, what 2 years ago we were calling Becky's. That kind of mix of the assumption of innocence and goodness along with this entitlement is weaponized by white women when they feel afraid, feel threatened, feel uncomfortable, feel any kind of way, and they feel like they can access the power of the state by calling 911 to help assuage those feelings of discomfort or to put other people in what they see as their place. It's really a lethal power that white women have access to, and it really needs to be addressed.
Professor McCloskey, you signed on to this open letter that was published in Harper's Magazine, 150, academics and journalists saying that we exist now in this cancel culture, and that there's not room for open debate, even when we are talking about, critical issues such as race and some of the racial violence we see on the internet. But that letter has actually gotten a lot of backlash. Can you just tell us, what was your purpose for signing on to it? And do you think the letter is tone deaf, given this moment that we're experiencing in this country where we see so much racial aggression against and racial violence really against African Americans?
Well, I have for a long time, ever since I was spanked by my father in South Station in Boston when I was 5 years old for saying about a reporter see the funny black man. I hadn't ever seen a black person. So that was a long time ago. That was 1947. So I've been concerned about this, about the racial history of the United States. I'm an economic historian, and I've been involved kind of on the outside, looking in the historical study of slavery in the United States and its horrible aftermath. So I'm on that side, but of course I think that on forums like the one we're on right now are very desirable. I mean, it comes as a surprise to many white people, and as Jesse says, many white females, suburban, college-educated sort of people, that there is systematic racism in the United States and that they're part of it. But that news, which has started to kind of drift into the white mind of the United States in the last month or so as a result of these filmed episodes, it's new. It's startlingly, it's new. As your guest earlier pointed out, it goes back to Emmett Till, and then long before. Other trees bear a strange fruit. So, and not just other trees, that being the point of the Central Park episode. But we have to be talking to each other. I don't mean in this kind of, let's all have a conversation way, but we need to be arguing with each other. And so I invite the pushing back. That's fine with me. Then we'll talk, and we might stumble on the truth.
I got to ask you, Professor Daniels, I'm sure you've had a chance to look at that Harper's Magazine letter, at least, if not read it in its entirety, you of course know about it. Some people say that the letter was a way to, remove accountability or in some way undermine the accountability for this kind of racist conduct that we're seeing in these videos. What do you think about that letter?
Yeah, I mean, without going into specifics about that letter, I think that letter is part of a larger move in the culture that starts to question public shaming, starts to question social media, when the subjects of any kind of public shaming or critique or pushback are white people, and particularly white women. I'll give you one example. A few years ago, there was a woman by the name of Justine Sacco, who was a white woman, and she was a PR executive. She was about to get on a plane for South Africa. She wrote an offensive tweet saying something about, I hope I don't get AIDS, I'm going to Africa. Oh, wait, I can't, I'm white. And then she turned off her phone and got on this international flight. And by the time that she landed in South Africa, the internet had blown up with public shaming of her, and she had lost her job. And then, then that turned into a whole book about how we should feel bad about her because she was publicly shamed, rather than situating her within this long history of white women and being critical of white women's behavior and place in society. So I'm always really hesitant when I hear people talking about cancel culture, because I wonder who they think is being canceled.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you say that, Professor Daniels, because, Donald Trump is always railing against cancel culture. But if we look at his Twitter feed, he cancels somebody, on the regular from, big broadcasts like, CNN to MSNBC, journalists that he doesn't like, politicians that he doesn't like, ex-girlfriends that he doesn't like. So he's constantly canceling someone, but yet he's always placing himself as the victim of the cancel culture. And that does concern me. So, and again, we're not just talking about that Harper's letter, but I was concerned about the letter because, again, I'm asking the question, is it okay to cancel? When is it okay to cancel, and who are the people that are now complaining about cancel culture? And are we taking away from the real issue here, which is the racist conduct of the women we see in these videos? And I did want to ask you, Professor Daniels, are we somehow minimizing, the concept that this is racist conduct when we use, the memes, when we see all these memes? I think my producer has, we collected some of them. When we see these memes that they go viral, they become, subject of comedy, comics make jokes about them. There's even an Instagram page now where somebody's actually commercializing this, this Karen concept. So are we minimizing the real impact here that Narendra and Fareed and Janae and Adrienne talked about so poignantly? Does that conduct get minimized when we see these memes and we use Karen rather than the word racist?
Yeah, I think there's a way in which the memeing does a couple of things, right? One thing that it does is it pokes fun at and sort of skewers the power that white women have in society, and it skewers them and us in a way that's very powerful and very effective. But if we stop there, if we just make it a meme and it's just a punchline, then I think it does minimize the way that it's connected to systemic racism. And that's the next step of accountability that I think has to happen, whether it's laws like the one that Supervisor Walton has proposed, or there are just other ways that white women get held accountable for their behavior. And that's so rare in this culture, that white women are ever, pointed out, ever criticized, ever held accountable for their actions. Instead, what we have is a culture in which white women, frankly, take up a lot of space culturally. If you look at, there's one magazine in particular that has a cover every year about Hollywood, right? And who the up and coming actresses are in Hollywood. And it's always just a sea of white faces. I mean, every once in a while there's a black woman that makes it in, like Harry Washington or something. But if you look at it over 15 or so years, it's just a whole celebration of white womanhood. And that's the usual way that we approach white womanhood in this culture. And so there's a way in which that contributes to these Karens getting away with calling 911 on people for painting Black Lives Matter in front of their own homes.
Yeah.
And I know, Professor McCloskey, I want to ask you, there's this argument that we need to have open debate. And when I look at that argument, I think about the Confederate statutes. And we debated the Confederate statutes for years. There have been efforts in states around this country to get rid of those Confederate statutes. And the debate didn't get very far. But when the protesters decided that it was time to bring those statutes down, and a lot of them came down, and guess what? The statutes aren't there anymore. So although there is, and I'm a lawyer, so I'm all for open debate, and I believe in the First Amendment just like everyone else does, maybe even more so because of my profession. But sometimes there's a need for debate, and then there's need for action.
Yeah, but be careful what you wish for, because after all, when Emmett Till and all the people before him were lynched, that was precisely the same sort of, oh, we don't want any of this legal stuff, let's not debate it. This person looked at a white woman on the pavement in Alabama, therefore let's hang him. So I think we all agree that we don't want a society in which everyone uses, well, I express it this way, in which there's a completely disproportionate reaction to one's anger, or a perceived insult, or a glance at a white woman on the pavement. Now observe, it's about 100 years since the vote for the country as a whole was kindly given to women. And in that good movement, many white women disdained the support of Black women for precisely that, on the grounds actually that they didn't want to arouse the racism of the men who were going to vote. Ida B. Wells was specifically excluded from a march in where was it? I think it was in Washington, in which the crowd of men attacked the women. So I'm an economist by training, but also a historian, and this isn't the first time that this kind of situation we're in now has happened. I'm very hopeful, though, that we've turned a corner, and I'd be very interested in the opinion of you and Jesse.
Well, I'll ask you, Professor. I'm sorry, Professor.
Do you think it has turned a corner or not?
And I'll pose that question to Professor Daniels. Do you think we have turned a corner?
Well, I think I'll draw on Professor Angela Davis here, who says that we're living through a moment that is truly different. I'm a little cautious, though, about how much change my fellow white people can handle, frankly. And I'm a little worried that even modest change will be too much for most whites to handle. I really hope that that we're at a moment where we're about to see really big changes happen. And I think big changes are going to make white people uncomfortable. And I think that's a good thing. I just hope that white people don't try and stop the changes that are coming.
Well, I'm sure you're familiar with Jane Elliott, Professor Daniels. Sure. So I had Jane Elliott on the show last week, and she said something that was pretty startling to me, and it stuck with me, and I've repeated it many times over the last week. And she said that she thought that this was a temporary situation, and that white women were going to stay on this kind of quest for racial justice and equality. She gave it a year. And then she said their husbands were going to tell them it's time to move on, that there are other ways to contribute. You can write a check to a NAACP or a social justice organization. But she wasn't very hopeful that this was going to become, not just a summer job, but it was going to become a lifelong endeavor to really address the racial inequities in this country. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean,
startling and very pessimistic view of Miss Elliott.
Yeah, Jane Elliott is super smart and has been doing this a lot longer than I have. And I think she's onto something there. I think part of what she's getting at there is that the real vulnerability for white women is often their alliances with white men and white families. I've said before publicly, and I'll say again here, that I really think that white families are the most effective and pernicious way that white supremacy gets reproduced. So to the extent that white women are sort of building fortresses around their white families, I think that it really is a kind of Achilles heel in the potential for change in the world. I mean, what I'm calling for in Undoing White Womanhood is for everyone, for white women especially, to begin to see, to extend that circle of caring beyond their nuclear family to a wider world. And I think that's what's going to create real change. But I think that that's really hard because we have so many forces in this culture that encourage us to look inward, just at the individual and the whole way that we talk about self-care, and just to protect a single nuclear, often all white family that, sort of mitigates against this broader sense of caring and real hope for social change.
Yeah,
so I just have I just want to ask both of you if you could say something to the victims of these Karens, Norinda and Fareed and Adrienne and Janae. What would you say to them? I don't know if in all the cases, I would doubt that. I know in Janae's case that there was ever an apology offered by the woman we saw in that video using those racial slurs. But what would you say to these victims who have suffered through this and who clearly, from listening to their stories, have experienced a great deal of trauma as a result of these encounters?
Well, I would say that I'm hopeful because of the many young people who are involved in these marches. It's striking, and I think they'll go on to be seriously racially sensitive people of the white color, if we want to talk that way. But I think we've got to be. I'm an Episcopalian. I'm a Christian, and I believe in treating people as Jesus advised us. And I think those people, those young people, will carry this into the age when they have a family that they're trying to educate as well as protect.
Great. How about you, Dr. Daniels? Any last words for the
I would just say to those people who've been harmed, I'm so sorry for the harm that's been caused by white women, and based on our our social position. I'm just so sorry for that, and I'm working to undo that harm.
Thank you.
You're here.
We've got to leave it there, but thank you so much, Professor Daniels and Professor McCloskey, for joining us in this critical conversation. And thanks to all of my guests, Norinda and Fareed and Janae and Adrienne. Thank you for having the courage to share your stories. Thank you for speaking up and for making this issue, helping us amplify this, because we can't fix what we don't acknowledge, and changing the race issues in this country and addressing racial inequalities in this country is going to require all of us to acknowledge first and foremost that it does exist. So again, thank you to all of my guests for joining us, and thank you for my viewers for tuning in. These conversations are not easy. Conversations about race, and you've heard me say this over and over again, we get so close in this country to having these critical conversations, and then we retreat and we recoil, but not here at the Special Report. We are committed to staying on these subjects and to continue to bring some of the most prominent voices on these issues and topics to help us learn and to educate us all, and also to tell these compelling stories like the stories you've heard from my guests this morning. And as a civil rights lawyer, someone who's been on the front lines of advocating for criminal justice reform in this country, I've been primarily against criminalizing the slightest behavior that we find unacceptable, because oftentimes we don't need more laws. We just need to enforce the laws that we have. But I think the law that has been offered up by Supervisor Walton is a very necessary law. If we're going to deal with this kind of racist conduct, we need to give victims the opportunity to seek damages in civil court. And we need to make sure that there are criminal penalties for anyone that would seek to engage in this conduct, whether it's the person calling the police because they were asked to leash their dog, or someone being told no, that they don't have a right to know if you have a permit to work on your own property. There has to be some consequences for that conduct. So I just think that we all need to send a message to the Karens of the world that they're being served, that their time is over, that it's up. We're no longer going to accept the kind of conduct that we've seen in these videos. This entitled, selfish, racist conduct will not only be televised, but it's going to be prosecuted. So again, thank you to all of my guests. Big shout out to my production team for putting this show together. And remember, we are all in this together, and stay safe out there.